Okay, endpoint and NAC protection. Why didn't NAC take off? Do you have NAC in your organization, Mike?
No.
Kind of died, kind of on the vine, kind of quickly, didn't it?
Yes.
Why? Anybody got any ideas why?
By what I heard by some of the engineers that I speak to, number one, it was pretty complicated.
Complex. That's one of the number ones, yep. Anything else?
The networks were always changing IP addresses, VLANs, so they were constantly making changes. That was an issue. The other issue that they had was that it never really worked as
advertised.
Exactly.
Yep. But even though NAC didn't go over, we got some good things out of it because endpoint protection still is valuable. Because NAC, where you try to do the enforcer and all that type of stuff, that became pretty difficult. But the endpoint protection was good because it helped us in this advances in malware and all that other type of stuff. Because in endpoint protection, you can modify what? You can tell it, watch for any kernel system calls or anything else, and you can actually track what's happening on the machine. So the endpoint protection part of it's good. The NAC part never quite took off. I wouldn't say it's dead, but I think it's on life support. I haven't seen many people roll it because when you tried to roll it, it was just too complex to set up. There's some really good things in it, but it takes a lot of work to get it set up, and most people just can't see the benefit of it. But the endpoint protection works pretty good because you can actually lock down the endpoint and say that node can't do this, can't do that, or anything else.
We have that.
You have endpoint protection.
Yes.
Yeah. Which one you using?
Safe.
Well, I haven't tried that one. No.
It's pretty good.
We have semantic here, and that's mainly because Security University's done quite a bit of work with semantic, so they gave her a real good deal on the licensing and stuff like that. Yeah. But this is why endpoint protection, I think, was the one that really survived. How many people have this threat? The USBs. It's the biggest threat out there probably to most organizations. The U.S. Army's banned them completely because they've had so many worms getting loaded into their network over USB. Corporate email, of course, right? Email on the public internet, Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is another big area because everybody, it's one of those things that is great, it's convenient. But depending on your architecture, where you put Wi-Fi is important, right? Don't put it inside the firewall like some people keep insisting to doing. I don't understand it. Those CD, DVD, but they're kind of like slowly but surely in the corporate world going away. People don't even order them on the computers anymore half the time. They'll have 1 or 2 DVD writers and that's about it. The PDAs have kind of been really dropped and now it's smartphones. Same concept. Because I mean PDAs, anybody really making PDAs anymore? They've really went to the smartphone concept. Yep. What about Bluetooth infrared? Printer, all this stuff down here. That's why they're all down here. So what are you going to focus your resources on? The top threat, right? Maybe a little bit down in here to the Wi-Fi. Those 4 would probably be the ones you would do the most in your organization. And that's what we're talking about here with endpoint. The endpoint is the answer for this, not NAC. And that's where people got a little bit mixed up between NAC and endpoint. And what does Microsoft call it? And Cisco? NAC or not? This is what we just talked about. We're going to cover it because it's still part of the defending your networks, but I just don't see it happening that much anymore. But nice thing was, what was NAC? Who's on my network? And this is where we really got into a pretty good idea, but the problem was, well, do you go client list, you go agent-based, management console, inline, how do you do it? This is where it started to break down because people had to figure out, well, how do you don't want to re-architect your entire architecture just for NAC, right? So this made the challenges, right? Enforcement disrupt my network. That's another place it broke down because it would enforce, lock somebody out who was legitimate. Right? So all these types of things is where we had problems. And of course, we also problem because we interrogate every device. Well, half the time you'd interrogate, and then it'd come up and give you warnings, and they were false positives. Yep. And that's why. Look at this. We don't want to make security and defending more complex than it has to be. This made it more complex than it has to be. So you start looking here, non-compliant devices, connecting in, VPN concentrator. What's the problem with all this? This is going to take a lot of time. What one thing don't we want to do in your networks today? Slow them down. I wish we could, because I always try to tell people, speed and security don't go together. But what's the comment from everybody who's in charge and pays our salaries? Make it happen. And as soon as you put in, the best example I can give of that, how many of you guys do content filtering? Yeah? Nobody hardly does, because if you do content filtering, all your web traffic and everything else like that, what happens? You go to the website and you sit there and wait. And you wait. That's why I know when I go to an organization and they got content filtering on, because I go to a website and I'm sitting there waiting. Like, you guys content filter, don't you?
I think the Bureau has it at some sites. Some of the sites that are
I bet they do.
heavy
But as soon as you have the content filtering, you know it, because you sit there waiting for that web page a long time. This was the same problem here. In some of the NAC implementations I was auditing and working with, stuff like that, you would see an actual one of these guys come in requesting access to the network, and they're sitting there waiting for a while to go through this process. That was the problem with it. So they're sitting there not getting an IP, and what happens? People get frustrated and they complain, so that's why NAC started getting, what did they do? They started, like we talked about with the IDS outside the perimeter router. They started just desensitizing it to the point where why have it? Network teams, right? Security teams, this is our NAC strategy. Executive management. Okay? Got to integrate them all with NAC policy decisions. Because the network team's going to have one policy, security team's going to have another, executive management is going to have another. And this is where NAC would have been probably a good thing, but going in to configure all these policies take time. And the problem was, anytime something changed, you had to go back and do your changes all the way across your entire NAC architecture. That's why endpoint, I think, caught on and everybody liked it and it stayed, was because you put the policy and you push it out to the endpoints. It's much easier than doing all these separate policies for every team. You just put host or node-based policies on what endpoint can do what and stuff like that. That's the protection. It's like at the machine, this was a user-level protection, right? So that's what we're talking here. Direction of goals and policy enforcement. How are you going to enforce the policy? Well, most decisions usually is what block, but the problem is, do you trust, and NAC, especially in the early days, do you trust the software to the point where it can do this? Yeah? So some different things to think about out there. There are some open source NAC solutions, free NAC, stuff like that. Right? Endpoint security is a little bit different, because now what we do is we manage any guests, any malicious threats, and we keep the box in compliance. And that's what we're doing here. We got post-connect. So once you connect, we got to do what? Every so often we got to check and make sure that you're still in compliance. You didn't connect and all of a sudden turn off your firewall if that's a policy rule. All right? Identity integration to make sure we identify you and integrate you into whatever role you require. That's what we're talking about with endpoint security. So NAC, who's accessing NAC? Well, as I said, Cisco and Microsoft worked together and called it NAP, Network Admission Policy, and it's on now all their new OSs and stuff like that. But again, you have to move in and out of the organization's infrastructure. So that's why probably getting it in your device or in your OS is a better solution than trying to go configure some big NAC box. This is the big one here. The best pro stuff I've seen of NAC is the U.S. tennis, right? Anybody watch the U.S. Open? No, U.S. Open. Yeah, the U.S. Open. Well, a couple years ago, they had the challenge of people coming in for US Open, requiring and they're requesting their press passes. Well, everybody today wants internet access. So how are they going to control the identity, like we're saying here, on custom access based on what country the actual guest pass comes from? Well, it's going to be extremely hard. So what they did is they implemented NAC and set it up where with NAC they actually controlled like captive portals. They put them in captive portals where they could do their email, do their internet, but it was a captive portal away from the US organization's main network. So that was a successful one. Then a university in the UK used NAC to stop peer-to-peer, because people were using peer-to-peer on them and stuff like that. So they used NAC to catch and capture all the peer-to-peer before it got into their network. So there are some uses for it. The challenge is defining your levels of custom access. So what do we look for in NAC? Control access to your environment, adherence to your security policy. So just like we started the course, number one thing is policy. We have to get our policy defined, set it up, and go from there. Okay? Reduce zero-day vulnerabilities, enforce your security policy, strict access controls, right? We have to authenticate the user, and automated detection and response. That's where we get into the challenge. Remember how we talked about how IDS, monitor, detect, and respond? Yeah? And respond is something that was always a challenge. NAC's the same way. We want it to automatically detect and respond, but what happens if it detects and responds and denies service to legitimate users, which happens a lot. Yeah? So what we normally do, when we roll NAC, is we put it in monitor mode only. Yeah? And there you go. This is how it works. Got somebody requesting access on our network. What do? We got a policy here that's an enforcement point and says, oh, we look at it and say, okay, do you have this? And we send it back to the decision point to say they don't have this, bang, block. Or put them in a captive portal state or an isolated VLAN is how we do it most of the time.